Our next reading, again, comes from the book of Acts. Acts was written by Luke, as in the Gospel of, who traveled with the Apostle Paul, along with Silas and Timothy, for part of Saul's journeys through the Mediterranean, spreading the good news of Christ. And here, that entourage is partway along a trip to tell new people about this Jesus that they had all begun to follow. So we begin in the 16th chapter, verses 9 through 15. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. We set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace. The following day on to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in the city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside to the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. We sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home." And she prevailed upon us. Thus ends the reading. I had forgotten how many linguistic gymnastics were required for that reading. And I confess, I actually did look up a couple of those place names. Again, it's like, is that really how you say that? It's a foreign to us area, and it was very much foreign to the four travelers, Paul and his entourage. Again, the lectionary, the reading shared by many churches worldwide, presents another story from the Acts of the Apostles. Last week, Peter met with a God-fearing Gentile named Cornelius, memorialized in this painting. And Cornelius was a Roman centurion of all things, who became a follower of Christ. This is a paradigm shift. Up to that point, Jesus, being Jewish, was for devout Jews, or so they thought. Peter came to the conclusion that God shows no partiality, and that in every nation, anyone who reveres God and does what is right is acceptable to God. So that was last week. It was kind of out of the blue after all the stories we've been hearing week after week. And today's reading, also from Acts, jumps in with very little context as well. And as Heidi Tyler reminded us some months ago, something that she and I had learned from professors in biblical studies, a text, a reading, without a context is pretty much a pretext. So, a little context, a little backstory, just quick. Before our reading, Paul first appears in Acts as a zealous Jew who's become a vigilante, killing early Christians as heretics. Yikes. Actually, his name was Saul, and he changed it because he was on one of his trips to do vigilante justice, and he has this mystical encounter with Christ. Literally gets knocked off his horse, so beautifully painted by Caravaggio back in like 1600. And Paul himself, after that vision, becomes not just a follower of Christ, but also a promoter of Jesus. He feels compelled to spread the news. Now, that's the backstory. I have to admit that what attracted me to today's reading from the book of Acts, even though it's in the lectionary, is in verse 12. It starts out with, "We set sail to Troas." Deborah will tell you that, especially this time of year, when boats are being launched and outfitted, anything that has something to do with sailing kind of turns my head. She's shaking her head over there. Deborah and I like to sail our little boat, and it always seems little on Lake Ontario, from one port to the next. Harbor hopping, we call it. You know, just not doing anything too adventurous or risky. Best laid plans. Deborah's over there going, uh-huh. And what's good about this harbor hopping thing is we meet local folks, we sample local specialties, and we take the slow road, as it were. And you meet some interesting people and creatures. We actually rescued a dog one day. But in the book of Acts, for the Apostle Paul, no slow road for him. Paul's on a mission, and he's got a crew. Paul is traveling with Timothy and Silas and Luke, who writes it all down, through an area that is now modern-day Turkey. And one night, Paul has this vision of this foreigner, this Gentile from Macedonia, and he begs Paul to come over to Macedonia and help us. Come over to Macedonia? A Roman colony with a bunch of Gentiles who have no respect for the laws or traditions of Israel. Paul's mind, after he wakes up, starts to churn, no doubt, thinking, okay, Macedonia, it's part of that Roman area, and there are unscrupulous businessmen. We know about enslaved men and women. They have temples to idols and false gods, and they have Roman magistrates that would happily arrest the followers of Jesus and flog them and throw them in prison. Unless you think it's just a worried flight of fancy, all this stuff actually does happen later in the book of Acts. Nonetheless, Paul says, let's go. In verse 10, Acts tells us that Paul, Timothy, Silas, and Luke immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim good news to them. Do any of you remember the Rochester Fast Ferry? Any of you go on it? Yeah. It was very kind of cool Star Trek-y there up on the deck, you know, you're going along really fast and it was comfortable and they had a snack bar and, you know, it was cool. Well, in first century Macedonia, travel by sea was not fast and it wasn't comfy. So crossing over meant hiring a merchant ship and hoping for favorable winds. Because although the Greeks and then the Romans were masters of the seas with their rowing and sailing triremes, or warships with a big ram on the front of them, and 3 sets of oars powered by slave labor, the merchant ships were a lot simpler. They had square-rigged sails, so they pretty much had to move where the wind allowed them. So it looks like, according to the story, that Paul and company did get favorable winds that pushed them for the fairly short harbor hopping across the northern Aegean Sea. Troas, to the island of Samothrace, where ships, we're told, regularly stopped overnight so they didn't have to keep going sailing at night, which we all know is a lot of risks. The next day, they sailed on to the northwest, to Neapolis, a port on the Macedonian side. They took a rest day, it says, and then made the last 10 miles west to Philippi. Yeah, they were kind of harbor hopping, except they weren't relaxing. They were on a mission to share some good news and the words of Jesus. And like wise salespeople, the entourage does a little reconnaissance when they get there. They hang out in the city of Philippi. Yeah, that's where the letter of Philippians gets sent later on from Paul. And as they're hanging out outside the city walls by the gate, seeking a place of prayer and looking to meet some local folks, they meet this woman who is a businesswoman. Now, Paul is not known for his respect for women, and I always have a problem with him on that in some of his letters. But here, he's following the example of Jesus, who always showed respect and honor to women as human beings, just like every other human being, like himself. So they meet this businesswoman, Lydia, the dealer in purple cloth. She's got a business going, and her family all decide, from hearing about the good news from Paul, to become followers of Jesus. And they are baptized, presumably right there in the river. And then Lydia offers them hospitality, saying, if you've judged me to be faithful, come stay at my place. It's interesting that she wanted to make sure that they judged her as faithful. Paul and crew, they accept. And Lydia becomes the very first European to convert to Christianity. She received this word gladly and becomes a follower of Christ with no concern about ethnic purity or status or fitting in. They are all just people. Paul and the crew and Lydia and her family, they see each other. Oh, wait, we had that saying about that. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. They had been changed enough to be able to perceive other people to be just like them, to be blessed human beings. We human beings are instinctually tribal. That's not the best part of our humanity. We tend to feel comforted by people who are like us in culture or looks or language, religion. But God doesn't see us this way. In our relating to people of different races and cultures, we need to learn to remember that everyone, according to the book of Genesis, is made in the image of the divine. Says John Pavlovitz, when you meet another person, you're coming face to face with a once in history, never to be repeated reflection of the image of God. If God is God, there's no other option. They are each made of God stuff. Every single day, you encounter thousands of breathing, animated thumbnail icons of the divine. You know those little icons on your smartphones that you touch? Yeah. We all are little kind of icons, reflections of the divine. Whether we're black or white or Asian or European or African or Latino or Native American, a person is made of God stuff. In the eyes of God, each is beloved. Our job is not to make them look or act or believe like us, but instead to accept, encourage, and affirm the best in them. And as we welcome them as our sisters and brothers, we are to show the kindness and caring that Jesus taught and exemplified. Sometimes that may mean we have to step up and speak up for what is fair and just. And sometimes that means we have to go out of our way to give our time or our talent or our treasure without anyone ever knowing about it, without getting a tax-deductible receipt, but just showing kindness. Seeing every human being as beloved of God also means that we, each of us, are beloved. Despite all of our mistakes, our shortcomings, and our flaws, beloved. Certainly, whether or not we get an invitation, in a vision, in our dreams, like Paul did, we, each one of us, are called to sail forth with the good news that every single person that we encounter has a spark of the divine and is beloved of our Creator. So, bon voyage. Amen.